And welcome to At Issue. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is H. Wayne Wilson. There is a lot happening in Washington, D.C., in fact, across the world, as the president laid out his plans for Afghanistan. We have the Syrian civil war. We have racism in America. A lot to talk about with the congressman who represents the city of Peoria, or at least a good portion of the city of Peoria. That is Darren LaHood, the Republican. And before we say Republican Peoria, we probably should point out that you also go all the way down to Adams County, Quincy in that area too.
Correct. Good to be with you, H. Our district covers all or parts of 19 counties, which are central and west central Illinois. We represent part of Peoria, Bloomington Normal, Springfield, Jacksonville, Illinois, Quincy, and up to Macomb.
And a lot of rural towns, and we'll talk about rural issues in just a moment. But let's start with something that has been in the news quite a bit, and that is racism, hatred, the chance of Jews will not replace us. And then the question of what has become known as Antifa, or Antifa, if you pronounce it that way. Is there something Congress can do? Is there a solution to this underlying current of hate in America?
Well, I think we all have to stand up against bigotry and hatred in this country. I've put out a couple strong statements on that, and you have to show leadership on this. We cannot normalize this type of bigotry and behavior that has gone on. And I've been disappointed in some of the statements that were made, particularly by the president last Tuesday, in which he said there was fine people on both sides. I don't agree with that. We have to have a strong moral authority on this issue and continue to speak out against bigotry and hatred. And we cannot normalize the actions of neo-Nazis or white supremacist groups or people that spew bigotry and hate, and we have to be strong on that.
It's gone so far that a famous football player, Anquan Boldin, has retired. Now, granted, he's had 14 years, he's 36 years old, but he retired. He was on the team, I think he was playing for Buffalo, and he quit because he can't stand what's going on. He says that NFL owners need to step forward and support their players when they refuse to stand for the national anthem, that we need to handle this question of bigotry, of hatred. And my question to you is, has President Trump been partly responsible for not necessarily encouraging, but allowing this to continue?
Well, I think words matter. And I think the president's statement last night was very strong, and subsequent statements that he's made since the comments last Tuesday, I think have helped to clarify his comments. But again, I go back to those statements of saying there are fine people on both sides of this issue. I think that's not the kind of language I would use, and I think that causes a lot of concern with me and a lot of other Republicans. That's not the party that I belong to, representing the same congressional district that Abraham Lincoln represented, and I think about our Republican Party not in those type of words. So I'm glad the president has clarified what he said and needs to continue to do that, but that has no place in our society, has no place in the Republican Party, and we as Americans have to continue to stand up and speak out against that.
When you talk about clarification of the words, well, one more question about President Trump. He seems to, when he's on script, and I assume someone else has written the script, he seems pretty good. But he goes rogue, as they say. He goes off script, he ad-libs. He delivers a completely different message on certain occasions. Is this harming the Republican Party? You said, this isn't my Republican Party. What's the take in Congress of where the president is taking the party?
Well, listen, I want the president to succeed because I want America to succeed. We have a lot going in this country, and so, the president was elected in this country as an unconventional person. He didn't come from politics or government, had never been elected. And obviously, I think we're seeing part of that in the first 7 months here. I think the president needs to be more disciplined. in any job you have, whether you're a member of Congress or you're a CEO or you're a teacher in a classroom, you have to be disciplined. You have to be focused. You have to have some filters. And do I wish the president wouldn't tweet as much? Absolutely. I have a lot of confidence in General Kelly. He's a man of strong, a strong background in the military. I think bringing him on as chief of staff is a smart thing to do. And I think, there are more things that the president can do to be more disciplined and more focused. And I think if you do that, I think we have a lot of opportunity to succeed and do well in this country. So I still have a lot of confidence in this president and his ability to succeed and do well. But you have to learn from your mistakes. And again, disciplined, focused, not tweeting as much. And again, working on the core issues, not on these collateral issues or these ancillary issues. Let's focus on tax reform. Let's focus on infrastructure. Let's focus on fixing healthcare. And the other thing that I will just tell you, I don't think it gets enough media attention, but you look at the stock market, it's up to 22,000. Small indication of the economy, but the economy I think is on the precipice of really taking off. Part of that is due to the new president getting elected. I think he's got a great cabinet around him, starting with Vice President Pence. A lot of smart, bright people that many of them have come from the private sector that are serving our country well. I think he's put an excellent Supreme Court justice on the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch. And so there's, some optimism there that doesn't get talked about enough because I think our media focuses way too much on controversy, sensationalism, and conflict.
Let's talk about those three issues you brought up. Let's start with health care. The campaign for President Trump was repeal and replace. That didn't happen. What's the future of health care?
Well, I wasn't in Congress when Obamacare was passed, but you're right. Republicans have talked about that for a long time. I think we're finding it was much easier to be an opposition party than a governing party. But we have to fix health care. If we do nothing, Obamacare is going to fail. The trajectory it is on is going to collapse. It's not sustainable. And we even saw that in the presidential race. Hillary Clinton said that. Bill Clinton said that. So we have to fix it. I was proud to vote for the bill we did in the House. I didn't think it was a perfect bill, but a step in the right direction. Premiums in our congressional district have gone up an average of 55%. So people now in our district are more worried about paying their health care bills than their mortgage. And that was never anticipated. So we have to fix that. We got very close in the Senate, but we didn't get it done. What I've said is the Senate has to go back and work on a compromise, whatever it is, to fix health care, drive down costs, have more health care options. That has to be a part of it. I think we're close. I've said all along, we should work in a bipartisan way to do that, to come up with a solution. Again, drive down costs, not discriminate against pre-existing conditions, and make our healthcare system better.
You mentioned two words. You mentioned compromise, you mentioned bipartisan. So are you saying that maybe the approach should be, let's take some of what works in the Affordable Care Act and put it into the AHCA and combine those two so that we have a bill? Or do we have to get rid of Obamacare first?
Well, I think the fundamental parts of Obamacare have to go. I think a couple things that have worked in there, being able to keep your kids on insurance till 26 is a good thing. Not discriminating against pre-existing conditions is a good thing. But there is no competition in the system right now. In the 19 counties that we represent, when Obamacare was passed, we had 3 or 4 healthcare options in every one of those counties. Well, all of those insurance companies are now pulling out. So in many counties, you have no options or maybe one insurance option. So the system is failing. So my point is, you got to bring competition in. I think you also got to be able to go across state lines for insurance, which is another part of what we've talked about in driving down those costs. If you think about it, only about 4.5% of the country has pre-existing conditions, but that's the biggest cost driver. Figuring out how we solve that problem is what we've looked at. And when I mentioned before, listen, the Senate got to 1 vote to passing a repeal and replace. Maybe they need to go back and work in a bipartisan way to do that. Again, we passed a bill in the House. What I say, the ball is in the court of the Senate now. They need to work on coming up with a solution. But we have to bring relief to the American people on this. Talk to small businesses, talk to people that are self-insured. Costs are way too high.
You held a meeting down in Quincy just a week or so ago. concerning the opioid crisis. 183,000 Americans have died from a drug overdose since the turn of the century. 183,000. What did you learn? Is there a solution in the offing here?
What I learned is we have an epidemic, and it is an epidemic that transcends all parts of our society, both rural and urban, socioeconomic, race. We now have more deaths in this country by opioid and heroin overdoses than we do car accidents. So what do we do about that? There's a couple things that we talked about. One is holding doctors accountable. Doctors prescribe way too much opioids, whether that's Percocet or Vicodin or whatever that is. There's clearly a push now to hold doctors accountable. Instead of getting a big bottle of pills that can be used for a lot of different things, that has to change. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, it used to be that heroin came from Afghanistan, Southeast Asia. Now it comes from our southern border across in Mexico. We have to stop the flow of cheap heroin coming across our border. So that's the second thing. Third thing is more money for rehabilitation. When you talk to people that are in the rehabilitation field and the recovery field, more money to help people that are addicted. The addictive nature of opioids is much different than it was 20 years ago. And that leads to then heroin. And then the last part of that is really a community effort. I don't think this is going to be solved in Washington, D.C., this is going to be solved organically. And we have to do that. I equate in some ways the opioid epidemic to what drunk driving was in Illinois 25 years ago. We had huge amount of deaths. So what do? Mothers Against Drunk Driving got organized. We passed laws. We changed the atmosphere. We had a public campaign. We brought that down. That's what we need with the opioid epidemic. The federal government can definitely help with leadership.
You mentioned rehabilitation and put more money toward it. Does that mean that you would be in favor of changing the laws so that we don't incarcerate so many people on the low level of drug offenses? I'm not talking about the suppliers, I'm talking about the users.
That has to be a part of it. I spent 10 years as a state and federal prosecutor, put a lot of people in jail and prison. I'm not proud of that, but what I'm saying is with low-level drug offenders, you cannot warehouse people in prison. You cannot warehouse people in jail. That is not a mechanism that has worked long-term in terms of rehabilitation. We have to have resources for recovery, addiction services, and rehabilitation. That is the mechanism to help people get back on their feet, giving people a chance to get through this addictive nature of opioid and heroin. And I think there's a successful model for that. And when we had Secretary Price in Quincy, that's something he's supportive of. I think you saw the president has said this borders on a national epidemic. Chris Christie has been involved with his task force on this. So we have to do something about it.
Let's talk about two of the other major issues that you mentioned earlier, tax reform and infrastructure. It would seem to me that during the campaign, both the Democrats and the Republicans said infrastructure is important. We need to improve infrastructure. You're real close to this because of your father's position when he was Secretary of Transportation. Why isn't infrastructure being addressed? It's not even on the table right now.
Yeah, well, I think there was a little bit of a miscalculation with dealing with health care first. I think people thought we'd pass health care pretty quickly and then move on to infrastructure and tax reform. That didn't happen. But you're right, infrastructure is a bipartisan issue. And the president in his State of the Union address back in February talked extensively about infrastructure plan, a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, which was pretty bold. I anticipate we go back to D.C. the Tuesday after Labor Day. Between then and the end of the year, we have to get this infrastructure plan put in place. We're already working in the House on that in a bipartisan way. This is an issue that will have bipartisan support. I think the biggest issue will be how do you pay for $1 trillion? A lot of talk about public-private partnerships, and I think those mechanisms work well in urban areas where you have mass transit, where you have tolling abilities, where you get a return on investment. So that'll be a part of it. In an area like ours in central and west central Illinois, that's more difficult to do, so you got to figure out a funding source. We've talked about the gas tax. People are a little hesitant about raising the gas tax unless they know the resources are going to roads and bridges and infrastructure. They don't like it when the federal government takes that money and it gets put in other places or gets swept, or there's not a lot of confidence in government spending that money. So I think we have to have what's called a lockbox mechanism, which we say if we do want to raise the gas tax because oil prices are low, that money has to be put into a lockbox and spent only on transportation. I think people have a lot more confidence in that, and I think you'll see that. The president has also mentioned that he's not opposed to raising the gas tax to fund infrastructure. And then the last part of this is, how broadly do we go, H, in terms of infrastructure? Does that include energy projects? Does that include locks and dams on the Illinois and Mississippi River, which we clearly need help on? Obviously, roads and bridges will be a part of that, but there's a lot of things that we can fund in infrastructure.
And as an example of the public getting behind a tax increase, the city of Peoria did that with a combination of small tax increases that were 100% dedicated to improving roads. In fact, more than doubled the amount of money dedicated to roads, which were sorely needed in the city of Peoria. Yeah. So, and also to point out that the gas tax is a flat tax. It's not a percentage, so it doesn't go up and down with the price.
Well, and to your point, in the last election in Illinois, we had an advisory referendum on the Illinois ballot, went to all the citizens of Illinois. If you knew that money would go to transportation in a lockbox, would you support it? It passed overwhelmingly. And the last point I would make, my district borders the state of Iowa. Republican governor, Terry Branstad, who's now our ambassador to China, but when he was there, Republican legislature, they passed a gas tax increase of about 11 cents. That money dedicated to transportation passed overwhelmingly. They now have a surplus and really good roads and infrastructure. So there are many examples. Again, I don't look at this as a partisan issue or Republican or Democrat, but making sure if we decide to go that route, we dedicate those funds to infrastructure and transportation. We need it in Central Illinois.
Tax reform is the other one of the big topics. You on your website talk about lowering the tax rate. You want it so simple as we could file our taxes on a postcard. I want to see that happen. Eliminate the death tax. Eliminate the AMT, the alternative minimum tax. What are the prospects of true tax reform in Congress?
There's a lot of people talking about it. And we have not had comprehensive tax reform since 1986. I was in high school at the time. We need it, and we need it for the economy. I think the economy is really on the cusp of really taking off in this country, and tax reform will help do that. If you think about the corporate or business tax rate, so whether you're a mainstream business in downtown Peoria or you're Caterpillar, paying a corporate tax rate of 36% is the highest in the industrialized world. By way of comparison, Ireland's at 14%, England's at 17%, Canada's at 22%, we're at 36%. So you look at that and how constrictive that is on whether it's a small, medium, or large business. We have to make us competitive with our competitors around the world. So our plan in the House brings that down to 20%. President Trump's plan brings it down to 15% to put us on an equal playing field. What that will do, if you talk to Caterpillar or you talk to a small or medium-sized business, if you reduce those tax rates, where will that money go? That money you save will go into wages for employees, will go into reinvestment into companies and business, and will also go back into the economy. The other part of this is, it's estimated we have about $2 trillion parked overseas of money that companies like Caterpillar or Walgreens or Boeing or name your corporation has put in different countries. That money will then be repatriated back to this country. That's an influx of dollars that will come back. So that's on the corporate and business. You mentioned about the postcard. We have a cumbersome, complicated, nuanced tax code. Simplifying that is what people want. That means closing loopholes. You're going to make lobbyists upset. You're going to make special interests upset, but we have to reform the tax code.
But you also are a proponent of reducing the national debt. We're at 19, pushing $20 trillion in national debt. If you simplify the taxes, if you reduce the corporate tax rate, have you done an analysis where there's sufficient income to at least balance the budget, not even addressing the question of reducing the national debt?
Excellent question. The answer is yes. You have to pay for tax cuts when you're $20 trillion in debt. How do you do that? So our proposal, somewhat controversial, is called the BAT tax, BAT tax, which essentially says if you were a net exporter out of the United States, you're not going to pay that BAT tax. But if you are a company like Walmart that produces a lot of products in other countries and bring them back into the U.S. to sell at Sam's or Super Walmart, you're going to pay what's called a BAT tax, a 20% tax to bring those products in. Now, the irony of this is every other country does this around the world. We're the only one that doesn't. This would harmonize us with that. But you're going to get a lot of pushback from companies that are going to have to pay that tax. But what will that do? It will incentivize companies to park shop here or to set up their operations in the United States instead of going overseas to do that. That BAT tax is anticipated to pay for the tax cuts that we need. So that's we have to figure out how we're going to do that. It can't be just cut taxes. You have to pay for that. So the BAT tax, you're going to hear more about that. The second point that I would make on comprehensive tax reform, H, is if we do nothing, we're going to continue to fall behind with the rest of the world. We have to change this again, and this will help to get the economy going. The last time we had a growth rate at 4% in this country was 1999. Bill Clinton was president, Newt Gingrich was speaker. They worked in a bipartisan way to have 4% growth. So what happened when we had 4% growth? And by the way, under the Obama administration, they always talked about a growth rate at 2 or 3%. We never got past 1.6 for any particular year. Way too low. When you have a growth rate at 4%, like we did in 1999, we brought the debt to nothing, zero. And we always talk about more money for all those things we want to spend it on. Research, infrastructure, education. We should be spending money on it, but it's hard to do that when you're $20 trillion in debt. Tax reform, if done the right way, pays for the tax cuts, gets us at a growth rate of 3 or 4%, it lets the private sector flourish, and we have more money to spend on those things that we should be doing in government.
Congress is not well respected by the public. I'm sure you're aware of that, and you're probably not too proud of that fact. But there is an effort, there is an effort to establish a joint committee to look at revamping how Congress operates, that you be held more accountable, that you become more efficient. What is the status of that effort? And is this truly going to be a bipartisan effort? Will we see results from this?
Well, I'm proud to be the lead co-sponsor on this legislation. We call it the Congress of Tomorrow. And my co-sponsor is a Democrat from Chicago, Dan Lipinski. And what we said is people complain all the time that Congress doesn't work. And in the less than 2 years that I've been there, it is clear that there are many problems with how we function. And anything in government, we always should figure out how we can make it more effective, efficient, and accountable to taxpayers. And fixing the Congress is something that we need to do. So what our proposal does is we set up a joint committee on how you reorganize Congress. This would be 12 members of the Senate, 12 members of the House, bipartisan, bicameral, that would meet for 1 year and decide how we change our rules, how we fix things. So for example, a lot of people have talked about changing the filibuster in the Senate. Okay, well, we don't have a mechanism on how we do that. Changing the authorization process in the House, how we fund things, appropriations process. We hear this all the time. We're up against a debt ceiling coming next month. We're not passing a budget on time. We're constantly on a fiscal cliff. What we've said is we need to reorganize Congress and figure out how we regulate ourselves. This is not a new idea. This has been done 3 other times in the last century. 1944 it was done, 1966, 1992. In 1992, they formed a joint committee on the reorganization of Congress. They met for 1 year. They came up with about 22 proposals. When the Republicans took over in 94, they implemented almost all of them. For the next 7 years, they passed a budget on time. We brought the debt down to nothing, as I mentioned. The point is, now is the time to do it. So when you say, what are you doing to fix Congress? This is a way to fix Congress. And we have 70 co-sponsors, almost equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, very conservative Republicans in the Freedom Caucus, very liberal Democrats that want to fix the institution.
I hate to do this to you, but real briefly, you just visited Lebanon. The Shias, the Sunnis, the Christians, it's not just Lebanon, it's all the Middle East. Having heard the president recently talk about the solution to, or at least the effort to solve the problem in Afghanistan, do you see a way with all of those divisions over there, do you see a short-term solution to the Middle East?
There is no short-term solution to that. There is not. But my own observation from being in Lebanon is there's cautious optimism with Lebanon in the situation they're in, but it's a very fragile situation in a very dangerous neighborhood. I also, as part of this trip, visited Israel too. You know, you think about the Arab Spring hasn't worked out the way that people anticipated. You have Libya, which is a lawless state. You have Somalia, which is a lawless state. You have Yemen, which is a lawless state. And you have Syria now that is a lawless state. So, you know, and underlying all of those countries is the Sunni-Shia conflict, right? Saudi Arabia aligned with the Sunnis and Iran aligned with the Shia. You know, we have to play a leadership role in this. And I worry about the Iranians and what they're trying to do in Iraq, in Syria, and in southern Lebanon. We have to put, we have to control Iran in terms of how they want to spread throughout the Middle East. So it's a larger issue that I wish we had more time to discuss.
We'll spend a half hour on that next time. How's that?
Sounds great, H. Thank you.
Congressman Darren LaHood of Peoria and all of West Central Illinois, thank you so much for being with us on At Issue.
Thanks, H.
And thank you for joining us on the program. Next time, we start the 30th season of At Issue, and we're going to do 3 programs with 3 retirees: Doug Oberhelman of Caterpillar, Doug Stewart of PNC Bank, and Kevin Shepline of OSF. They are retired or will be retiring soon. Their take on their careers, on the company's role over time, and what the future of Central Illinois is. The next 3 At Issues with all 3 retirees right here on At Issue.